They said the rule was for safety. They posted warnings. They mailed letters with fines that stacked like bricks. Then one morning, the sound of a cement truck echoed down the cul-de-sac, and by noon, the only thing feeding the house, an old, legal well, was entombed under wet gray stone that hardened like a threat in the ground. The board smiled for the cameras, called it compliance, and told the neighborhood it was handled. But the taps inside hissed like empty lungs. Food spoiled. The shower ran cold. The paperwork disappeared. The appeals timed out. And every minute felt like the board wanted the family to break first, not the rules. So a different call was made, not to the HOA, not to a lawyer. To the office the board never thought would answer. A single complaint, a reference number, and suddenly the streets bloomed with vests and clipboards. Valves were tagged, lines were traced, and within hours the same board that buried a lifeline felt their own pipes turn to silence, with neighbors stepping out onto porches, listening to the quiet like it was justice arriving through copper and steel. The board called it a misunderstanding. The inspectors called it something else. And when the sprinklers stopped mid-arc, the panic finally showed. Most mornings began with quiet routines and small rituals that made the house feel like a promise kept. A kettle singing before sunrise, a sleepy dog circling a sun-bleached rug, the gentle clink of a lunchbox snapped shut at the counter that faced a window full of sky. The neighborhood had its own clock, sprinklers whistling just before dawn, school buses sighing at corners, joggers tracing the same loop past the same yards, where flags hung straight and mailboxes were painted to match. On maps, it had a tidy name and a brushed metal sign at the entrance, landscaped with stone and seasonal flowers. In conversation, it was simply the community, where neighbors waved at each other's trash day and the Friday food trucks set up by the clubhouse like a movable holiday. The homeowner worked from a small office off the hall, a space that smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. It was practical more than pretty. A sturdy desk, a second-hand chair that creaked in exactly one spot, a corkboard of to-do lists and dates. The dog snored. Sun pooled on the floor. The well pump, hidden behind lattice and hedges, hummed softly, a sound that had blended so fully into the daily fabric that silence would have sounded like an alarm. That well was old but legal, inspected years ago, tucked within the property line like an heirloom more than a machine. It was a holdover from before the subdivision spread itself in identical parcels, and it fed the house honestly and without fuss. There was a comfort in clean lines and clear expectations here. The HOA sent newsletters with cheery banners and tidy bullet points, movie nights, pool maintenance, a reminder about mailbox heights and exterior paint palettes approved by committee. The rules were pitched as the price of order and the promise of value, community standards, curb appeal, protecting investments. Most of it felt fair. Nobody wanted a car up on cinder blocks or a collapsing fence. Order, after all, can feel like safety when everyone agrees to it. But safety can be stretched like plastic over something else, and the stretch can start so quietly that it looks like nothing at first. A line added to a newsletter about water sources and uniform systems. A note from the property manager that certain legacy installations may require review. An email about ongoing alignment with municipal guidelines wrapped in a template with a stock photo of a smiling family in front of a house with sprinklers misting like champagne. No one was panicking. It was just a line, then a form, then a request for documentation that had lived in a file for a decade and suddenly needed to be resubmitted in triplicate. The tone was breezy, apologetic, coded in phrases like, "Thanks in advance," and "We appreciate partnership." Neighbors talked in driveways the way people always do, low, casual, drawing circles in air with coffee cups. "Did you see the email? They probably won't enforce it. They can't tell us what to do with stuff that was there before, right?" The worry sounded almost embarrassed. Nobody wanted to be the one who overreacted to a PDF. And the homeowner had other things to do. Work deadlines, a leaking garden hose, a child's permission slip hiding somewhere the dog absolutely knew about but wouldn't reveal. Life continued, as it does, because most tension arrives not like thunder, but like fog, tightening its grip as it gets harder to see. The first real hint wasn't a letter. It was a visit. The property manager's car idled at the curb a little too long, the way engines do when the person inside needs courage. A knock that didn't sound like a neighbor's. A clipboard balanced against pressed slacks. Polite words about compliance checks and schedule efficiency. A quick look around the yard, the kind that tries to appear friendly while counting. The manager smiled at the hedges, at the paint, at the dog who watched from the window and didn't bark. Then the manager's eyes drifted toward the corner. A quick look around the yard, the kind that tries to appear friendly while counting. The manager smiled at the hedges, at the paint, at the dog who watched from the window and didn't bark. Then the manager's eyes drifted toward the corner where the lattice breathed in the wind, and the smile became a measured line. "Is that the well access?" they asked, voice soft and bland, like a spoon stirring water. A picture was taken, not furtively, not with any attempt to hide it, just the straightforward posture of a person doing a job they would later claim was only about process. It would have been easy to ignore the feeling that arrived afterward. A small, precise pressure behind the ribs. Maybe nothing. Maybe paperwork. Maybe a quick inspection and a stamp and life returning to its usual pattern. The well humming at dawn. The kettle singing. The dog snoring. The homeowner sent an email with the original permit attached and copied the municipal contact who had signed off on it years ago. The tone was clean and practical, the way people write when they still believe in systems. Attached for your records, as previously approved. Happy to answer any questions. A reply arrived with an auto-signature long enough to qualify as a short story, thanking them for their diligence and promising review. Days passed. The newsletter that month repeated the water sources language, nudging it forward like a chess piece, still small, still non-threatening. The community Facebook group lit up with guesses about what it meant, then cooled off when someone posted a picture of a raccoon stealing a cinnamon roll from a porch. People prefer small dramas to large ones because the small ones ask less of them. Still, a neighbor mentioned, casually, that they'd been told to upgrade their trash enclosure to match new guidelines, even though theirs was fine. Another had received a friendly reminder about a garden statue visible from the street. A third had been asked to trim a tree to a recommended profile that existed nowhere in any handbook. Little things, harmless on their own, a shape, if you knew where to look. The homeowner began to notice the tone at board meetings shifting by degrees. Where once there were questions, now there were explanations. Where once there were discussions, now there were slide decks, alignment, standardization, long-term viability. The words felt like uniform shirts. You could wear them, but they didn't look like anyone in particular. During open comment, a resident asked about elderly neighbors who used wells for irrigation before the community lines were extended and whether their costs would rise if forced to switch. The response was clipped. "We'll address that under new business." New business never seemed to come. Outside, the world carried on with persuasive normalcy. Kids learned to ride bikes in cautious, triumphant loops. Packages landed on porches, disappeared, then reappeared in the form of shoes. Someone learned to play the trumpet. Someone else learned to complain about it. The homeowner's dog grew fascinated with the side yard, as if it could hear something the humans could not. The well pump hummed reliably, a baseline for the song of the house. It was the kind of steady that people mistake for permanent because it has not yet failed them. The first official notice arrived on a Wednesday because, of course, it did. Midweek asks for resolve. It had the letterhead, the seal, the unmistakable posture of something that intended to be obeyed. It did not accuse, it advised. It did not threaten, it informed. It referenced non-conforming water infrastructure and immediate steps to mitigate community risk. It assigned a deadline with the softness of a hammer wrapped in velvet. The homeowner stood in the kitchen reading it while the kettle clicked on and the dog thumped a tail against the cabinets. They read it twice, 3 times. The words did not change. The feeling behind the ribs did. The notices evolved like a storm does. First, a gray edge on the horizon, then a sky that forgets to be blue. The third letter swapped advised for required, and the fourth added a chart with penalty tiers, as if punishment needed a pie graph to be real. Each envelope carried the same scent of printer ink and inevitability, stacked on the counter like a countdown pretending to be mail. The language was spotless. That was the most unnerving part. Not a single frayed word to catch a finger on. Everything smoothed to the point of denial, everything wrapped in the tone of people who insist nothing is wrong as long as they enunciate properly. The first fine was administrative, small enough to be dismissible, large enough to be insulting. The next came 3 days later for failure to engage. That one was almost impressive, the way it accused while implying help was available if only the homeowner would be reasonable enough to request it. Emails multiplied. The portal showed tickets that appeared and closed like fireflies. A chat window blinked to life at odd hours and then informed the homeowner to please submit inquiries via the appropriate channel, which linked to the same place they already were. It felt less like communication and more like a maze designed by someone who loved walls. Board meeting agendas started listing water source alignment beneath community events, as if a potluck and a punitive policy were parallel forms of fellowship. The phrase legacy installations became a chant, always followed by standardized solution, which everyone understood meant eliminate the old and make it match. A vendor presentation, that word again, vendor, promised bulk pricing on community-consistent water upgrades, complete with smart metering and centralized oversight. The slides were clean. The men presenting had excellent posture. The board nodded in a RH, rhythm that had nothing to do with actual thought. At home, the well continued to hum like a good soldier who had no idea it had been drafted into a war. The homeowner filed an appeal in triplicate, attached documentation, cited the inspection, linked to municipal code. The response acknowledged the submission, assigned a reference number, and then provided a deadline that had already passed. When the homeowner replied to point out the impossibility, the system flagged it as duplicate inquiry, closed it, and sent a satisfaction survey. Somewhere between the language and the logic, fairness bled out. A neighbor texted a photo at dusk, a truck idling near the clubhouse with the vendor's logo on the door. The next morning, flags began sprouting along sidewalks and over lawns, neon pinpricks marking underground lines. The yard looked like a map designed by someone who didn't believe in straight paths. Someone painted a temporary X near the well access. No letter mentioned it. No one admitted to it. The homeowner brushed the paint away with a rag until it smeared into a green shadow. It still felt like a target. The first site visit happened on a Tuesday, a day whose only sin was being between Monday and Wednesday. 2 board members and the property manager arrived with casual smiles and the energy of people who had practiced the scene. They complimented the hedges, admired the paint, and positioned themselves so the well was always at the edge of the eye. When they spoke of liability, their voices softened, as if the word itself could panic the grass. There's a risk, they explained, to the community. The homeowner asked for specifics. The specifics were unhelpful. We're following best practices. Our consultant flagged it. We have to think about everyone. Everyone, it turned out, never included the person standing in their yard with a folder of legal documents. Tai! The fines climbed. Daily non-compliance. Escalated enforcement phase. Failure to remove. Numbers attached themselves to days like barnacles. The portal showed a balance due, then a larger one, then a red banner that looked a lot like shame. A certified letter warned of lien consideration if the matter was not resolved. The letter assured it hoped to avoid that outcome. The letter was lying in the way that paper lies, by saying nothing true and everything legal. At night, the homeowner couldn't decide whether the hum of the pump was reassuring or accusatory. Sleep arrived in fragments. The dog, unsettled by the late pace in the hallway, took to curling near the back door, ears twitching at every car that rolled by and slowed. When headlights washed across the lattice at 2 a.m., some part of the body that humans share with animals stood up alert inside, ready for a threat the mind had not yet named. The next morning, muddy boot prints were visible near the access panel. The camera at the corner of the house had been turned just enough to frame the fence and not the ground. No one admitted anything. The homeowner filed a complaint with the city's utilities department and copied the county. It was a gamble built on a principle learned in other hard places. If a person with power will not be just, sometimes a system will be if forced to look at itself. The person on the phone listened without interrupting, then asked for dates, names, and copies. "We'll review," they said, voice calm in the way of people whose calm is actually focus. The homeowner hung up and felt the first real breath in days. The well hummed on. Somewhere, a meter ticked for a house that did not pay it to. Life continued, rude in its indifference. 2 days later, cones appeared at the end of the street. A maintenance notice warned of brief water interruptions for system upgrades. The vendor, truck returned, and this time a small crew in vests walked the sidewalk as if it belonged more to them than to feet. A backhoe rattled over asphalt. The homeowner watched from the porch, eyes drawn to the gleam of a new valve housing installed nearer to the property's main. It was not on the plans the homeowner had been shown. It was, someone would later claim, temporary. Temporary is a word that does a lot of work when someone needs it to. The property manager sent an email reiterating expectations and urging cooperation. It contained a link to schedule a removal appointment. The calendar had exactly 2 open slots, both during the hours when the homeowner would be at work. A reply expressing unavailability generated an auto-response inviting the homeowner to contact support for alternative times, which forwarded to the original calendar. Circular logic is the water wheel of bureaucratic control. It looks like movement and produces nothing but exhaustion. That weekend, the board held an information session at the clubhouse. Folding chairs formed rows. A screen at the front glowed with a deck titled Water Stewardship Plan. The first slides were familiar. Stock photos of dewy grass, smiling children, an aerial shot of houses arranged like polite sentences. Then came the bullet points about community risk liability, insurance premium exposure, and unauthorized water sources. The homeowner stood and spoke when questions opened, calmly, clearly, about permits, inspections, and the inspection sticker still on the well access. A board member nodded sympathetically, then suggested that municipal approvals can be outdated when a community matures. Mature is another word that makes control sound like growth. Other residents asked about their own notices. A woman mentioned her irrigation well used for a small vegetable patch, hands twisted together like she could hold onto the soil with fingers if policy tried to take it. A man spoke about fixed income and fines that had outrun his pension. The property manager answered with phrases that didn't stick to anything. "We're exploring options. We hear you. We need to be consistent." The vendor rep smiled without teeth and offered special pricing on conversions if people signed up during the implementation window. The room felt like it was tilting slightly. Afterward, the homeowner exchanged numbers with 3 neighbors who looked like they'd just stepped off a boat into a weather they hadn't planned for. A text thread formed, small and tense and urgent. They shared photos of notices and screenshots of portal balances. They compared wording and dates. Patterns appeared. The same deadlines. The same follow-ups. The same fees toggled in unison, as if pushed by a single finger. Then came the morning the water across the cul-de-sac ran rusty. A cluster of residents stood in driveways holding clear glasses turned orange. The vendor truck idled again, and when asked, a worker shrugged. "Flush your lines." The board sent a message assuring no cause for concern. The HOA's Facebook page hid comments and pinned a post about the spring fair. Fear and frustration make poor neighbors when leadership refuses to be won. A week later, the homeowner woke to silence. Not the comforting quiet of morning, but an absence of the hum that had underwritten every day. The pump was still. The tap coughed, stuttered, stopped. The dog looked up, head tilted as if listening for a song that had been cut off mid-note. Panic is a precise animal when it has a target. The homeowner went outside. The lattice was intact. The access panel was locked. No signs of tampering. No mud on the grass. The camera feed showed nothing but the edge of the world where nothing seemed to happen. The city returned the homeowner's call that afternoon. An inspector would come by to review concerns. The tone was neutral. The words were routine, but beneath them lived a seriousness that suggested someone had read the attachments and not dismissed them. The HOA, alerted by some mechanism that always seemed to know when the homeowner breathed, sent a new notice. Unauthorized interference with community infrastructure is strictly prohibited. It was both irrelevant and threatening, a combination that often precedes overreach. The inspector arrived in a city truck with a clipboard and an expression that watched without judging yet. They asked to see the well, reviewed the documents, traced the property line with calm feet. They asked when the pump failed. "This morning." They made a note. Then they walked to the curb, opened a utility box the homeowner had never thought about, and frowned in a way that only people who understand systems frown. "Who installed this valve?" they asked, although the question felt like a statement. The homeowner said they didn't know. The inspector didn't smile. "This is not on the city plan," they said, and took a photo. Within an hour, additional vehicles arrived. More vests, more clipboards. The HOA sent a message requesting that all conversations with outside entities be coordinated through the property manager to ensure consistency. The city ignored it. A second utility box a few houses down contained something similar. A third had a tag with the vendor's name and a date from the week the cones first appeared. The inspector's voice changed slightly. Not louder, just firmer. They asked for access to the HOA's records of any approved work on community lines. The property manager explained they would be happy to provide that once appropriate requests have been filed. The inspector filed one on the hood of their truck. That evening, water sputtered and returned in the homeowner's kitchen with a cough like a smoker trying to apologize. It wasn't the well. The city had bypassed the temporary valve and restored flow to a broader section. The HOA sent a stern message describing uncoordinated interference and warning of safety liabilities caused by unverified actions. The city responded with a notice stating that any modifications to public infrastructure require municipal approval and that unauthorized installations will be subject to immediate review and correction. It copied the board. It copied the vendor. It copied the insurance carrier. Fines paused, then resumed 2 days later at a higher rate, with the explanation that due to escalation of the situation and refusal to comply with removal of non-conforming infrastructure, penalties will continue per policy. The amounts didn't look like numbers anymore. They looked like intentions. The homeowner, calm now in the way people become when fear is replaced by purpose, documented each entry, time-stamped every change, and sent everything to the inspector with a note, "For your records." The dog slept more soundly that night, as if the house had remembered how to breathe. The board scheduled a special session and posted a late agenda announcing a vote to authorize remediation actions for non-conforming water sources. The language could mean anything. In practice, It meant permission to hire the vendor to remove wells. The homeowner read the agenda 3 times, then called the neighbors from the text thread. They would attend. They would bring copies. They would bring facts. People who have been told they are a problem learn to become a pattern. The meeting drew a crowd larger than anyone expected. It's remarkable what people will show up for when they realize the thing taken isn't just one person's. Voices were low but firm. Hands held papers. Eyes watched the board with the specific attention that appears when someone thinks they might be lied to. The board chair opened with a prepared statement about protecting the community. The homeowner waited for public comment and then stood, speaking into the room with the kind of calm that sharpens a point. Permits, inspection dates, municipal code, photos of the temporary valves, the city's notice, the vendor tags, the fines that marched in lockstep. The vendor rep attempted to clarify. Their clarification fell apart under the weight of the inspector's presence at the back of the room, arms crossed, not speaking, taking notes. Someone asked if the HOA had approved any modifications to public infrastructure. The board replied they had authorized maintenance support. The inspector's voice carried, "Public infrastructure is not maintained by private vendors without city approval." Silence worked its way through the chairs like a wind. One board member suggested a compromise. The homeowner could cap the well, keep it as historical, and connect to the community line permanently. The homeowner asked what problem that solved that hadn't been proven to exist. The board smiled sadly, as if being reasonable meant surrender. Then a motion was made. Then a vote. Hands rose. It passed. The next morning at 7 a.m., the vendor truck returned with a cement mixer rolling behind it like a threat with wheels. The homeowner stood on the porch, phone in hand, the inspector's card in the other. The property manager approached with a form to sign granting access for removal. The homeowner declined. The manager explained that under the vote, the HOA had authority to remedy non-conforming elements. The homeowner asked where in the CCRs the HOA was granted access to private property for demolition of permitted installations. The manager blinked. The vendor crew waited. The mixer idled. The moment stretched, taut as wire. The call to the city went through on the first ring. Words were few, names were specific, times were recorded. The inspector said, "We're on our way." The vendor crew shifted from one foot to the other, looking less like certainty and more like hired men at a line they didn't want to cross first. Neighbors trickled onto lawns, phones in hands, pajamas visible beneath coats. The board chair arrived with a smile that looked practiced in mirrors. The inspector's truck rounded the corner and parked at an angle that suggested ownership of the moment. They stepped out, asked 3 questions that were not small, and then asked to see the HOA's authority to enter private property. The board chair referred to the vote. The inspector asked again for the section of the CCRs. The chair offered the minute from the meeting. The inspector repeated the question. Nobody produced a page. The inspector turned to T-Bam, the vendor, and said, "If you proceed, you do so without municipal authorization and against a documented permit." The mixer quieted. It should have ended there. It didn't. 2 days later, while the homeowner was at work, a different crew arrived with a different truck and no logo. The camera caught them lifting the lattice, found the angle again where it couldn't see. The dog barked itself hoarse, a high, panicked sound that made the neighbor across the street call and keep calling until the homeowner's phone found service in an elevator. By the time the homeowner pulled into the driveway, the crew had vanished. The hum was gone. The access panel was sealed with a layer of fresh cement the color of bad intentions. Shock is quiet. It sits you down and makes the world move away for a minute. Then something older than language stands up. The homeowner took photos. They called the inspector. They called the police. They called the insurance carrier. They sent everything, every image, every timestamp, every note taken in the weeks when it looked like paranoia to keep such careful records. The inspector arrived first, face set, and documented the scene like a teacher grading a test someone had tried to cheat on in front of the class. The police took a report and said words about civil matter that you can hear 1,000 times before they stop sounding like a shrug. The HOA sent a message that afternoon. We regret any distress caused during the necessary compliance process. Rest assured, the community's water services remain unaffected. It did not mention the permit. It did not mention the city. It did not mention the fact that someone had entered private property and destroyed legal infrastructure. It mentioned the community 3 times. The homeowner stared at the screen until letters stopped meaning anything and then began to mean too much. There is a point in some stories when fear becomes fuel. In this one, it happened in the space between an exhale and a call to a different office, the one whose title includes the word investigation. The homeowner asked for the Utilities Department's Enforcement Division. A woman with a patient voice took the call, listened like someone who had heard this shape before, and began to ask questions that turned the mess into a map. She requested the vendor contract. She requested the board minutes. She requested the emails. She requested the photos. She requested the contact for the board's legal counsel. We'll be issuing a stop work, she said, and an order to restore. The last word felt like a door opening. That evening, the street filled with the specific quiet that happens when something communal shifts. Neighbors dropped by with updates. Their fines had paused, then reappeared, their sprinklers coughed, their comments on the HOA page had been deleted. Someone printed the city's notice and taped it to the clubhouse door. Someone else watched the property manager take it down and replace it with a flyer for a yoga class. The text thread went from small to crowded, names stacking like sandbags against a rising flood. A retired attorney in the cul-de-sac offered to review the CCRs. A teacher who had served on a board years ago explained how to call a special election. Someone compile and a list of residents with wells and those with unusual maintenance near their valves. A pattern grew ribs. Days later, the Enforcement Division issued the stop work order and a directive that any unauthorized modifications be reversed under city supervision. It referenced penalties that made vendors rethink invoices and boards rethink posture. The HOA sent a message insisting it would engage constructively with municipal partners. It paired the message with new fines for failure to comply with community standard water connections. The contradiction could have been funny if it weren't happening to taps. The restoration appointment was set for a Monday morning. The city truck arrived. The vendor did not. A second notice went out, then a third, then a fine, this one not to the homeowner but to the HOA, for non-compliance with an order. The board posted an update about ongoing good faith efforts. The enforcement officer posted a copy of the fine with a sticky note tone, "This is not a suggestion." When the crew finally came, the work was supervised like a test taken under a teacher's gaze. The cement was cut, the access panel was freed, the line was inspected, cleared, restored. The hum returned slowly, shy at first, then steady. The house exhaled. The dog slept with a sigh that sounded like a small version of relief. The HOA sent a survey asking residents to rate their satisfaction with the resolution process. The homeowner closed the tab with a steady hand and a plan. It began with a clipboard and a microphone, which is to say, it began with proof and the means to carry it beyond the room where people had learned to pretend they didn't hear. The city's enforcement officer requested a special community meeting to address corrective actions, and for the first time, the board agreed without trying to rename the problem into a listening session. Notices went out by email, text, and door hangers stamped with a municipal seal that had the quiet authority of a signature older than any current board member. People arrived early. They brought copies. They brought phones. They brought their own memories, which had grown sharper after weeks of being told they were mistaken. The clubhouse lights hummed. Folding chairs formed rows that felt like a small amphitheater. At the front, a long table waited with name placards lined up like small identities. The board sat as if they owned the room. The officer sat as if they owned the process. The homeowner stood against the wall, the folder of documentation heavier now that it had become a narrative with an audience. The board chair adjusted the mic. "Thank you for coming," they began, with a smile that looked borrowed. "We're committed to transparency." The officer raised a hand and asked for a copy of the vendor contract authorizing any work on public infrastructure or private wells. The chair's smile thinned. "We'll be happy to provide—" "Now," said the officer. A rustle moved through the room as if the air had decided to change sides. The property manager flipped through a binder. Pages turned with the frantic politeness of someone trying to find a stair in the dark. What they produced was a scope of work summary with blocks of text that said much and committed to nothing. The officer placed it on the table like a specimen and asked again for the actual contract with signatures and dates. Sigh. Lentz sat down in an empty chair. Then the officer lifted a second document and the temperature of the room shifted. A letter from the city attorney's office, stamped and dated, notifying the HOA of an investigation into unauthorized modifications to municipal water infrastructure and potential trespass and destruction of permitted private property. The board chair reached for a glass of water and discovered there was none. It was a small detail that looked like foreshadowing. The officer continued. "We have identified at least 3 unapproved valve installations on city lines, and at least 1 instance of concrete poured over a permitted private well without authorization." A collective intake of breath washed the back row. The officer's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. It carried the sound of a lever being pulled. Then came the part that mattered most to the homeowner, the footage. A screen flickered to life behind the table, and the officer played a composite of camera clips submitted by residents, timestamps aligned, angles stitched. The video did not show faces clearly. It showed actions unmistakably. A truck without logo, a crew in plain clothes, lattice lifted, camera nudged. A gray slurry poured and smoothed with the efficiency of men who had done this before. The footage paused at the frame where the wet surface caught the porch light like a lie. The officer asked, "Can anyone here identify the individuals or the authorization for this action?" The board chair cleared their throat and said the words people say when they already know the room is not on their side. "We will refrain from comment on ongoing matters." It sounded like retreat. The property manager attempted a pivot, speaking about community standards and risk management. The officer placed a printout on the table like a card face down in a game, then turned it over. A copy of an email, from the vendor's regional manager confirming a site task scheduled for that day, with a CC list that included the property manager and 2 board members. Someone in the back said, "Read the names." Restoration didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like the house remembering itself. Water threading back through lines, the well's hum steady and low, a rhythm that had nothing to prove and everything to sustain. The first shower felt like a small ceremony. Steam climbed the mirror as if reclaiming the corners where worry had gathered. Dishes clinked, laundry whirred, the kettle sang without apology. Each ordinary task returned wearing the quiet dignity of a thing that had been threatened and survived. The dog slept heavier, the way animals do when a house returns to the shape it chooses for them. Outside, the fountain at the entrance stayed still. It seemed right that the public face would be the last to come back on. Paper followed, as paper does when systems correct themselves. The city's corrective order, now posted where everyone could see, outlined reversals and timelines in firm, procedural language. Fines related to non-conforming water sources were voided. Accounts reflected zero balances with short notations that read like amendments to a story that had been told wrong. A second notice confirmed that unauthorized valves were removed or bypassed under municipal supervision, with a map of corrected points that made sense to anyone who had traced colored flags in their yard weeks prior. The HOA's insurer sent a letter to residents that did something rare. It separated responsibility from rumor. Costs for corrective work would not be passed to homeowners. Coverage questions regarding the HOA and the property manager were reserved pending investigation, the polite legal version of a line drawn in firm chalk. The homeowner's folder transformed from a shield to an archive. It lived in a drawer, not on a table. Copies of permits sat beside the photo of fresh cement, and, later, the photo of the access panel clean and open again. There was an order in that sequence: damage acknowledged, restoration documented, authority clarified. The enforcement officer scheduled formal statements. The room where the homeowner testified smelled like copier toner and strong coffee, the exact symphony of a bureaucracy doing what it is supposed to do. Questions paced through dates and decisions. Answers were concise, facts stacked without leaning. At the end, the officer thanked them in a way that was not performative, one professional to another who had done a careful job under pressure. Consequences began quietly, then arrived all at once. The board chair's resignation, announced as personal, was followed by language from the city attorney that suggested something less flattering: referral for further review, preservation of records, cooperation expected. The property management company released a statement about mutual separation. Residents read it alongside the insurer's reservation of rights notice and understood the space where those two documents overlapped was called accountability. The vendor's logo, once a fixture at board presentations, vanished from inboxes and flyers. In its place came municipal notices with dates and signatures that meant something. The special election took place under a level of attention that would have seemed absurd a month earlier and felt essential now. The clubhouse turned into a civics classroom: ballots, clipboards, names checked and lines initialed. Neighbors spoke to neighbors without intermediaries, a small miracle after weeks of being told to route all concerns through appropriate channels that led to dead ends. The new board, a blend of new faces and seasoned residents, opened its first meeting with an agenda that didn't hide the hard things under community events. It began with corrective actions, transparency, and a vote to create a water policy committee co-chaired by a municipal liaison, APE. Maintenance shift from improvisation to alignment. They didn't stop at policy. They went after practices, the everyday mechanisms that had turned politeness into pressure. The fining process was overhauled. Clear timelines, third-party review for disputes, written citations tethered to specific covenant language rather than vibes and vendettas. Retaliatory actions were prohibited outright, documented in a clause that referenced recent events without euphemism. Board meetings moved to a format where open comment didn't become a cue for scolding. Sessions were recorded and posted. Minutes included votes and names, not just outcomes and platitudes. It looked like minor architecture, but it built the room where fairness could live. For the homeowner, the shift showed up in small mercies first. The portal balance stayed at zero. Notices about lawn height and trash cans did not materialize out of spite. Emails received answers that addressed questions instead of redirecting them into loops. The dog returned to sun patches on the rug as if they had invented warmth. The well hummed and became background again, which felt like victory measured correctly. The folder in the drawer redefined itself as an heirloom, a story that would matter only when someone needed to know how not to get lost. The city's investigation reached its next threshold with a press release that spoke in careful terms about preliminary findings, unauthorized modifications, improper enforcement, breach of municipal code, potential trespass and destruction of permitted systems. It did not say everything. It said enough. Alongside it came a civil action notice to recover costs, fines for non-compliance, and the formal suspension of HOA authority over water-related common area maintenance until verified compliant. For residents, the tangible part was simple. The city would handle the lines that connected them publicly, and the HOA would stay within fence, as it could legally defend. Accountability at the human level didn't look like a perp walk. It looked like depositions scheduled, documents produced, access logs compared to invoices, and names in email CC lines asked to explain themselves under oath. It looked like the property manager answering questions about accelerated enforcement and conversion minimums. It looked like the interim board voting to cooperate and preserving records that had once been treated as private property of people temporarily occupying public trust. In the text thread, the retired attorney sent check marks next to milestones, not because anyone needed validation, but because seeing a process acknowledge itself helps a community believe in time again. The neighborhood changed in visible ways. The fountain stayed quiet through the season, not as punishment, but as a choice. No public embroidery until the fabric underneath could hold it. The entrance sign got a small plaque. Municipal Partnership established for Water Infrastructure Oversight 2025. It was plain, and that was the point. Yard sales returned. Kids chalked hopscotch grids on sidewalks that had hosted cones and flags weeks before. A Friday night food truck parked by the clubhouse and served tacos beside a table where a city liaison answered questions without telling people to file tickets that would vanish.